away the next 2 Sundays, so I'm at least going to be here for the next 2 Sundays and possibly longer, because he said when he gets back, it's kind of another busy season for him. So we're just kind of trying to figure that out on the fly. I told him I will definitely cover this week and next week, and then if he needs me a little bit longer for another week or two, just let me know. So I was trying to figure out what to do in the meantime, and to come up with something that's really relevant. And I keep going back to the Great Commission and kind of thinking about where we are as a nation and some of the things that we're seeing, some of the recent developments. Of course, we're living in the wake of COVID. That definitely impacted the world. I mean, on a global scale. It impacted economies. It impacted certainly the job force. It impacted families who lost loved ones. We all know people who died to COVID. It just impacted every facet of everybody's life. We talk about the COVID babies, the kids and babies that were born during the pandemic. And some of the setbacks that they experience, kids are behind on speech because of mask wearing. One of my sister-in-laws is a speech pathologist. She's working with children who really are struggling with big challenges. Leah, your cousin as well, speech pathologist. They're feeling the weight of this, and they see the results of the pandemic. So we're seeing that part of it. Of course, as I mentioned, the global economy right now is really putting a lot of pressure on places and people that were already struggling. We have some guests here from Haiti, and I keep in regular contact with people in Haiti. And, as of a couple months ago, I don't know what it is now, but as of a couple months ago, the price for a gallon of gasoline in Haiti was about between $15 to $20 US. And so you can imagine, we complain about gas prices here, but you can imagine in places that are really struggling and they depend on that fuel for their livelihood. I mean, they absolutely have to have it. It's really challenging, and we're seeing a lot of civil unrest. Of course, there's the war going on that now is kind of in the backs of people's minds, but it's still really significant. The Russian-Ukrainian war. We have a lot of civil unrest here in this nation. Violence is on the rise. There's a lot going on. And so Christianity, in the mix of that, Christianity is in a free fall. The number of churches that are closing their doors, because there was already kind of a problem with churches not reaching out and evangelizing. That problem was exacerbated, kind of sped up throughout COVID. It's not that COVID created a church crisis, it's that it exacerbated a problem that already existed. And so we have this kind of mixed bag, and I think a lot of Christians right now are in this strange place where we're kind of wondering, okay, what's our next step? What do we do as Christians? Where do we begin? How do we start? How do we reach people? How do we minister to people? Who do we minister to? There are so many needs. If you literally take a dart and just throw it at any random place in our town, you're going to find a need everywhere. There's not a place where problems don't abound. And it becomes overwhelming. And I want to begin with a clarion call where Jesus commissions his disciples prior to his ascension. And we all know this passage really well. It's the Great Commission found in Matthew 28, starting in verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. I think this is really important. I want to stop here for a second because remember, Jesus had risen from the dead, and his disciples who had been with him throughout his entire ministry, who had left everything to follow him. They left their jobs, they left their families, they left everything to follow Jesus. They witnessed the miracles, they witnessed people being raised from the dead, they witnessed demons being cast out, they witnessed miraculous healings, feeding of the 5,000, feeding of the 4,000, on and on and on and on and on. They were witnesses to this and performed many of these miracles, and yet they doubted. And I think that's significant because if we're honest, how many of us ever experience waves of doubt, at least in ourselves? We experience doubt, and we experience frustration, and we experience downtimes, and we experience depression, and we kind of get in this funk where we're like, okay, I don't even know where to turn, you know? I don't know where to turn to evangelize, to reach people for Christ. Like, I don't know where to turn. I mean, honestly, how many of us struggle with that? Probably all of us at certain points. And here you have the 11 disciples who are up on this mountain waiting for Jesus. And they saw him, and some of the 11 worshiped him, and some doubted. I think that's really significant. Because that doubt is in all of us. And sometimes we read the scriptures, I think, on such a surface level. And we gloss over certain things and we're like, yeah, well, of course the disciples, they're commissioned and they go out and they have the Holy Spirit. And, Jesus commissioned them directly and they were with Jesus. And, they're like these super giants who go out, and these spiritual giants, and they go out, and of course they can reach the world. But we're in 2022 and we don't have all of that. And I think we forget that they were human, one. They doubted, two. They're looking at Jesus, worshiping him, and they doubt that it's actually him. That's significant. And Jesus doesn't chastise them. He doesn't correct them. He doesn't say, you have little faith, as he did, at certain times throughout his ministry. Jesus does this next. With them doubting, knowing that they're doubting, that it's actually him, that he's actually alive. It says this. This is what Matthew records next. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. And then he ascends. He leaves them. I think this is so significant and so powerful because I feel like many of us just experience and feel this weight of the world right now and all the things that are going on and this big global crunch that people are feeling. And it's overwhelming. And here you have 11 people. 11 people. And the fate of Christianity rested on their shoulders. And some of them doubted. That's our team. That's our powerhouse. These are the people who are going to carry Christianity. Now, what were they up against culturally? What was going on in the first century during this time when Jesus ascended? Well, it's a lot of the stuff that we don't really talk about, at least not often enough, I don't think. But Judaism was a hot mess. If you remember the Maccabean Revolt that happened, 150 some years prior, this was a bloody, bloody war to reclaim the temple. Paganism had descended on Jerusalem. There was all kinds of idol worship at the temple. The temple was being used by secularists, by the Gentiles. And the Maccabean family, they eventually revolted against the government and against all these different forces to reclaim the temple as God's holy temple, as the sacred place of worship. I think we forget that sometimes when we read the New Testament. We forget the significance and the emotional attachment and spiritual attachment and physical attachment to that temple. And Jesus took that and upended it and put it on its head and said, okay, from now on, I'm the temple. And your bodies are my temple. That's a significant shift in thinking for Jewish people. You want to talk about a struggle? Take aside all the Gentiles going into all of the world. Take that aside. Just focus on the Jewish people that they ministered to initially. The Jewish audience was a tough crowd. You ever hear of any, say, disciples or Jesus Christ being chased out of places by Jewish people? Being threatened? Riots? Wanting to push Jesus off a cliff? When he healed the man in the temple with the shriveled hand, they chased him out and were looking for a way to kill him. They wanted to shove him off a cliff. On and on and on. There was a radical resistance to anything that threatened the supremacy of the temple. That's what they were up against. But that wasn't it. That was not even the tip of the iceberg for what they were up against. You had the Greco-Roman culture in the middle of all of this, and the Jewish people were plopped right in the middle of the Roman Empire, where this Greco-Roman culture existed all around them. Now a lot of Christians are up in arms over a lot of this stuff going on, and understandable some of the bizarre stuff that's happening, and the propaganda, and you can't get away from all the pride stuff everywhere, and it's just being forced on people. And you're seeing all this stuff all over the place, and just the sexual exploitation of everything. It's everywhere. I mean, you can't avoid it. You can't get away from it, period. And so a lot of people are really, really upset by this. And I go back in time to the first century in Greco-Roman culture, especially the Greek culture, where everything was about sexual exploitation and weird, bizarre stuff, radical stuff that kids were very exposed to. Kids were victims of, in the Greek culture. Pedophilia was rampant and normalized in Greek culture. This was the culture that existed. These were the people who they were going to preach to. And so there's this colossal issue of going into the world and trying to figure this thing out and preach the gospel to people who didn't want it. They didn't need it. They didn't want it. Everybody had their gods. There were state gods. You remember Paul, I think this is one of the most telling examples. When Paul is in Ephesus, it's the longest stay where he was anywhere. He's there for 2.5 years. And towards the end of that, Christianity really took root. And there's a goldsmith who's making gods. And he's like, this man is forcing people, which wasn't really true. He said, this man's forcing people to worship his God, and it's putting me out of business. And the people were livid. And there's a riot in Ephesus, and I still, when I get this picture in my mind, and I look at the stadium that Paul was at that still exists. You can still, if you go on a religious tour in Ephesus, you can stand in the place where Paul stood when he's looking at this crowd. That stadium holds 24,000 people. And it's jam-packed full of people saying, "Great is Artemis of Ephesus. Great is Artemis of Ephesus. Great is Artemis of Ephesus." And they're shouting and screaming. They wanted Paul dead. And Paul's whisked away and he's taken out of Ephesus to spare his life. His companion said, Paul, because he wanted to go in and preach. He's like, well, here's a captive audience. I'm going to preach the word of God. In typical Pauline fashion, he wanted to go preach. He saw an opportunity. And his friends, his companions drag him away and they're like, Paul, no. They're going to kill you this time. And they take Paul away. That's how ingrained this culture was. This pagan culture was everywhere. And so this is what the disciples are up against. When he commissioned them to go into all the world, this is what they were up against. So I want to read something. It's a recent article by Tom Rainer. And of course, I read a lot of stuff from Tom Rainer. I think he's got a lot of really good stuff and really has his finger on the pulse of what's going on in the church in America. And he says this. He wrote this blog, I don't know, a few days ago. He said, "A church without evangelism becomes a church that does not make disciples because there are no new Christians to disciple. A church without evangelism becomes a church where members fight over their preferences because the members do not focus on reaching those who are not followers of Christ. A church without evangelism becomes a church without true fellowship because true fellowship not only cares for its own, but it looks beyond its own. A church without evangelism gets mad at the pastor because the members think they pay the pastor to do evangelism for them. A church without evangelism becomes a church that does not do ministry because there are fewer and fewer members to do ministry. A church without evangelism becomes a church that strays from the Bible because the Bible clearly teaches to evangelize people with the gospel. A church without evangelism becomes a church giving less to missions because there are fewer people to give to missions. A church without evangelism becomes a church without prayer because churches that truly pray are concerned for the lost in their communities. A church without evangelism becomes a church that cannot worship together because there are fewer people to attend worship services. A church without evangelism will soon close its doors. And that's probably best. Because that church stopped being a church long ago when it decided to no longer be obedient to the Great Commission of Jesus Christ. Pretty pointed blog post. I mean, Tom Rainer doesn't mince words in that post. And I think he has some pretty valid points in that. I think churches that don't evangelize are churches that doubt and then some. The disciples doubted and they still followed the Great Commission. They still went out. They still trusted to the best of their ability. And they went out and completely went on a limb and trusted God with faith. And I think if I were to have true confession time, a lot of the times I really struggle with that because we like security. We like to know that there's going to be some ROI, return on investment. We want to know that if we're going to invest X amount of hours or X amount of dollars, that we're going to get X amount of return on that investment. We want to know, is this worth my time? That's kind of a human thing. That's not necessarily a selfish thing. I think that's kind of a human tendency to say, am I going to get some kind of a return on this, or is this a waste of my time? And so here the disciples, I think, are plopped right in the middle of this explosive world problem like we never have known. And hopefully we never do know. And 11 people were told, go into all the world and make disciples of all of the nations, teaching them to obey everything that I commanded. Your job is to baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit and teach them everything I commanded. I'll take care of the rest. This is your mission. This is what I commission you with in the middle of this world with all this unrest and people who are loyal to their gods and Jewish people who are loyal to their temple and their God. I want you to upend that and teach them about me. And Christianity, as we read in the book of Acts, exploded. To say Christianity was successful is the understatement of our entire existence on this earth. Again, one of the most telling letters that I've ever read was you have Pliny the Younger, who's a governor, writing to Trajan, the emperor in Rome, which is as high as you can possibly go in the government. He's writing him in circa 110 AD, so not far removed from when Paul's planting churches. Paul and his companions in the book of Acts, 50s into early 60s, are planting churches. By 110 AD, Pliny is writing Emperor Trajan saying, I don't know what to do with all these Christians. I'm taking people who claim to be Christians and I'm torturing them and I'm giving them 3 chances to recant and they refuse to do it. And he's mystified by this. And he says, the temples, meaning the pagan temples, have been deserted. That was a huge deal. I mean, that's a radical, significant shift in culture where the temples were the lifeblood of every single city. I mean, the temple was like town square. That's where people bought their meat. It was the meat market. All of these animals that were sacrificed to the gods. It was always hustle and bustle at the temple. It was their central place in every single city, town, and village. That temple was very significant. And Pliny's writing the emperor saying, all of our temples in the region have been deserted because of these Christians. That's significant. And so where does that place us, and where are we at right now in our culture? I'm looking at the demographics. I put up the demographics of Somerset County, right where we live, and I think this is really telling. And I don't know, maybe it'll interest you guys, maybe it won't, but I thought it was pretty fascinating. Somerset County is the 3rd most religious county in all of Pennsylvania. That kind of surprised me. So how many people claim to be religious? That doesn't necessarily mean they're church-going people. They just claim that they're religious people. It's 58.7% of the people in Somerset County. So what's interesting about that is I broke the numbers down. We have like 73,000 some odd people in Somerset County. We have just under 7,000 in the borough of Somerset. We have just over 7,000 in Somerset Township. So that kind of gives you an idea of our demographics right here. But in the county, in Somerset County, 43,439 people consider themselves to be religious. 30,188 claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. So agnostic, could be a God, maybe there's not. Atheists, they're all kind of lumped into that. 30,188 people just in our small county here have no religious affiliation whatsoever, which means, at least my takeaway is, they're not dedicated to any gods like they were in the first century. Which means to me, it's easier to evangelize people who have no religious affiliation than to take people who are strongly religious and to say, let me shift your way of thinking. And let me really tell you about Jesus, especially for people who are already Christians. They claim Christianity, to shift them just a little bit and to say, why don't you hop denominations? That's tough. And historically, in the churches of Christ, at least, since probably about the 50s, 60s, that's where we spent most of our time and attention, is taking people who are already deeply religious and part of a denomination and saying, why don't you jump ship and shift over here? Rather than taking this group of people who have no religious affiliation whatsoever and saying, let me teach you about my God, your God. And so for me, I see this massive potential right here in our own backyard. Massive potential. And it's kind of interesting. There's a saying about catching the low-lying fruit. What does that expression mean? What's it mean? If you're capturing low-lying fruit, usually it's meant in the context of insults. When you insult somebody, somebody will say, well, you're just taking low-lying fruit. It's kind of like a sucker punch, like you're taking the easiest route. But put in this context, low-lying fruit is the easiest to pick from, right? It's right there. You don't have to climb a ladder. You don't have to shimmy up a tree. You don't have to really search high and low for it. It's right there. You can just grab it and keep going. There's low-lying fruit all over us. There are people with no religious affiliation who are so desperate for meaning in their life. They're not getting it from turning the TV on. I can assure you of that. I'm sorry, but Jerry Springer and Maury don't really give a whole lot of meaning to people's lives, People are looking for meaning, especially in the context of a world where there's heaviness going on. People have lost loved ones. People are struggling economically. People are really battling depression. I mentioned it a couple weeks ago in a sermon I read off from the CDC's website. Depression, anxiety, panic attacks, suicides, they're all radically increased in the last 5 years. Dramatic increases. And it's not because of better record keeping or anything like that. These numbers are increasing. People are feeling the weight, and they're feeling a sense of hopelessness, and they don't know where to turn. And a lot of Christians are doing this. Saying, well, I don't know where to start. The world's too corrupt. Disney's gone berserk. Whatever it is. People are coming up with excuses when their evangelism is within reach. Even in the third most religious county in all of Pennsylvania. There are many, many unchurched people right in our town. So I'll close with a couple more demographics that I think are really interesting. This is as of 2021, so this is the most recent census. This is, again, Somerset County. Population, 73,627. Of that, we have about 25%, a quarter of our county as people age 18 and younger. A quarter of people are kids growing up. About half of our county growing up with no religious affiliation whatsoever. What does that mean for generations to come? People who are unchurched will raise unchurched families, and that'll go on for generations and generations. And of that 59% of people who claim to be religious, many of those will fall away. According to all the trends that are shown right now, the majority of those people will fall away from the church and raise what? Unchurched people. We are one generation away from being a godless country. And that's just numbers. That's an unemotional, just looking at statistics and tracking statistics. We're one generation away from being a nation that claims no religious affiliation whatsoever. In our county, we have about a quarter, 23.1% of people 65 years and over. That's significant to me because, as you guys mentioned, your neighbor who fell. How many people are in that age bracket who have no family, no friends, no neighbors who check on them? Visit any one of our nursing homes, and especially post-COVID. I mean, it was bad before, but right now, post-COVID, visit any one of our nursing homes and talk to the nurses about how many visitors come in and visit the people who are in those homes. It'll break your heart. There are people who are sitting alone, waiting to die. We can either sit and be depressed about that and say how awful it is and humanity's terrible and that's just awful and we feel so bad. Or we can say, what an opportunity to talk to people. And how many of those people have no religious affiliation and nobody's bothered to take the time to talk to them about Jesus Christ? How many of those people have never had somebody talk to them about Jesus Christ? Probably a pretty significant number. And by the way, when you minister to people in that age group, what does that say to people who are family members of them who can't visit, who might be out of town or out of state or whatever? What does that communicate to them when Christians come in and they take care of their elderly, aging family members? What does it say? These people care, you know? It makes our God more appealing. There's a bunch of other statistics that, about half of our population is made up of females, so we're split 47% female, so few more males than females. But what's significant about that, let's see if I can find it in here. Of that, we have a majority of females who work, which is pretty significant. And a lot of those females are single females trying to feed mouths and take care of themselves because husband left them, boyfriend left them, whatever. They're trying to raise families on really low incomes. And this has income data here. What does that say for the church? There are needs everywhere. It was kind of interesting. We drove around town, me and the kids drove around town, just kind of looking at people's yards after a conversation we had on a Wednesday night, taking care of people and just doing different outreaches in town, just to get to know people and talk to our neighbors and take care of basic needs. We're driving around town, and it's unbelievable. When you actually look, it's unbelievable how many places are just completely overgrown. And these houses are occupied. These are not abandoned houses. There are some, but the majority of these houses are occupied, and the yards, things are just completely overgrown. Which tells me, most likely, that what? You have probably elderly people or disabled people who can't get out and even mow their own yard, and their house has become an eyesore, and they have nobody to help them. Wouldn't it be nice to just knock on doors and ask permission? Hey, can I take care of your yard? We did that in Virginia when all those tornadoes came through in 2011. We went down to Abingdon, Virginia, and we did tornado cleanup. And what was really cool about that was it was our young people, it was our teenagers who sat and visited with people while we cut up their trees. So we had some people, some of us were like chainsaws and having a blast, just ripping through wood, cleaning things up. But it was our teenagers who, without even being told, they just went and sat with people and visited. And just that, the significance of that alone, I'll never forget the amount of tears that we saw on that trip, of people who are just so appreciative and so grateful. People who said, we've never been treated this kindly ever before. And it gave us opportunity to talk to people about Jesus Christ. And I think we make it more complicated than it needs to be. And we get wrapped up in our own schedules and, our own stuff. And we forget that the commission to the disciples is also our commission. God commissions us to evangelize, to go out, to continue this. If we don't continue this, then Christianity loses. Christianity dies out. So I get excited. I think honestly we are living in a time where there's so much, ample opportunity to go out to reach people and be a neighbor to our neighbors. So I'll leave you guys with that, and then we'll dig into some more scriptures next week and look at more examples. We're out of time. We'll pick back up in a few minutes.